start the tape going. Paul, can you come in periodically and do some positioning changes during my questions?
Now and then.
Okay, just keep your eye for that.
Well, I'm not going to do. You just decide when you want to reposition because.
Okay. So why don't we start by, why don't you identify yourself and tell me about you as a person today. Who are you today?
Who am I today?
Mm-hmm.
You want me? Are we going?
We're going.
Oh, good Lord. I'm a retired from business. Worked all my life, early life.
No, wait. Everything will appear on there. The other thing is that it'll pull his eyes to you. So what you've got to do is both not move, because that'll draw his eyes, and keep your voice quiet. Don't talk. Okay. Start again.
My early life, I worked for the railroad and lived in 19 cities. Grew up there, had 4 children, and my wife died in 1958. I married again for a short time, and a child was born at that time. That did not work, and by the time about that time, the railroad transferred me to the West Coast, and there I met Jean, and we've been married over 30 years, greatest part of my life, and we have a very happy life.
Tell me about meeting Jean.
Meeting Jean, I met her at Yosemite at a convention. She collected the money for the California Grape and Tree Fruit League convention. And that's where I met her. And she was the lobbyist for the California Tree and Fruit League. Anyhow, I met her there. 1 year later was the next time we had a date at the convention in San Francisco. And I invited her to dinner. As we were going down in the elevator, a wife of a man that I was calling on whispered to Jean and said, "Be careful of that guy. He's got 4 kids." So that was the first time we had a date. That evening, where we went, the officers of the league also decided to eat there and invited us over to dinner. And I guess they started looking me over. Well, I was a little hesitant, and that evening I hurriedly went home. But we started dating, and on weekends Jean would come down and meet the children. And Nancy was away at Purdue University at the time, and we got well acquainted. And always Gail would return with us to San Francisco when we'd take her home for the weekend. And she would look on her watch and say, "I'll stay in the car, Daddy, and I'll give you 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and that's all, and then we'll be off." So that was the weekly deal when Jean came down. The next year at the convention, we had the 3 children, Nancy still at Purdue, and we were married in, I can't remember the name of it, San Rafael. And it was an interesting wedding. And we had my best man had a meeting for us. After deal, and we all met at his house. But then at the convention that night, it was the last night, I had ordered champagne and had a whole tub champagne there. Everybody came over and introduced themselves to us, and we had a great time. That's probably one of the highlights of my whole life. And we've had lately a very sad experience losing Gail.
Why don't you talk about what Gail was like as a baby first?
Well, she was red-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, and that was probably part of the problem, because that's what she died of cancer, which the sun cancer, and a person that fair, in those days we never knew about it, and they went swimming at Santa Cruz, out in the sun all the time. Today, people are more informed, and that shouldn't happen anymore. I get sunspots over my forehead and everything, and they're taken off now, and the doctors know what to do. But it's a very fast disease that spreads.
What do you remember of your fondest memories of Gail when she was a child? Playing or whatever?
Oh, I don't know. She was the youngest and most spoiled. And well, I tell you, one thing that is very important was just as she was graduating, or she was still in school, and it was right after Sue's marriage, and she wrote us a letter, Jean and I, and said she wanted Jean to adopt her. And I guess the tears must have come down her eyes and everything. And that summer she came home, and Jack Evans, my friend, arranged with a domestic judge. And I recall that the judge said, "I'll take care of this last," and which he did. And when he asked Gail, he said, "Would you like this woman to be your mother?" And she said yes. And he says, he said, "I've been in this business for I don't know how long, but he says, I always have the people come in, and usually the child is nothing more than a youngster of a year or two old, and the mother or the father answers for them." And he says, "This makes my day, because now I know that she really wants this done." So I think that was the greatest tribute that I can give to Jean, because she was really so attached, and she knew what she wanted to do.
What were Gail's strengths? What would you say her greatest strength?
Oh, she was...
I talked over you. Start again.
Okay. Gail's strengths were that she was an artist in her own right. and she could do calligraphy, and we've got some wonderful things that she's written. This Christmas, Nancy gave me a thing that was a script, part of scripture, wasn't it? And and she had it framed for me and said that Gail had given it to her, but it was to go back to her sometime later. Very touching.
What about when you were a young man? What business did you go into?
Well, the only thing, I came out of the Depression. I was the Depression baby. People don't know what the a depression is in this generation, but we did. This was back in the late 20s and so forth. And I got out of college in '36 and started with the Illinois Central. The first job I had was a signal helper. However, I had worked that summer before as a signal helper in New Orleans, so I knew a little bit about it. But I was not a technician, and I never would have been. And so finally, I did get a job, and I started as an office boy in the traffic department. And I did pretty good. And I ended up after 19 cities in Mobile, and that's where I've retired. That's where I live. Jean and I, we have a very nice home. And we play golf and enjoy it. And we have everything there that we want.
Paul, could you set the camera, give me a wider shot? Give me an intermediate.
Did I move?
No. I want different shots.
No.
Good. Thank you. Want a drink?
Yes. Whiskey.
Tell me about when you said you were a depression. Yeah, for most people, when they think about the depression, they had to go out and get jobs right away, and you still were able to go to college. Can you talk about what it was like and your other friends, how they were affected by the depression, how your family was?
Well, yes, I can. The railroad was in trouble. Everybody was in trouble. My father worked for the Illinois Central, and they took 10 days pay that they eliminated. And then they took their monthly salary and reduced it by 10%. But everybody took that. So it went through the whole deal. People that were in Chicago that were teaching, they were given script. Policemen worked for 2 years without ever being paid. And it was difficult. The crime was not as bad. The mobs in the I guess you'd call them the rum runners and so forth, and the Al Capones, and that type of people, that was the only crimes that were really running rampant. It isn't the same here. You could go home and without having a door locked. Today you can't. But
your life during the Depression, were you did you worry that you'd be able to go to college? Did you worry
No,
that your father would, I talked over you again, so you have to,
No, really, I didn't feel that I couldn't go to college. My father had a good job as a time in those years, and my sister Jean was going to school. She had won a scholarship at the University of Chicago, but then she decided to quit school for a while and finally got her degree later. But tuition was cheap. We lived in Illinois, and I think my tuition was $30 a semester. Today, it's so hard for people, unless they have a scholarship or unless their folks are in the highest bracket, they just can't make the grade. Now, at the same time, I waited tables, but that was easy. And I lived in a fraternity house, and but today 2 months and would have cost, that would be the total cost that I had through the whole year. So it was easier to go to school. There weren't many of us that did go to college after high school, but nonetheless, it was, you could make it if you tried.
did any of your friends from high school go to the same college you did?
No, but I met a lot of friends in college who I still close to today. So that, therefore, it's, I guess I was the only one at the time that went to Illinois, but the rest of them those that did go to college went to other schools. But there weren't many. I think probably out of the graduating class, maybe 18 out of like 175 went to college. Today, thank goodness, there's a lot. It's almost 95%.
Did you find college very hard, or did you find it a lot
Yes,
of
I found
fun?
it
Well, I talked over
very
you.
hard.
Start.
College was very hard for me. In high school, it was very easy. I was at a high school that was, it should have been more academic and harder to, but you could slide through. You can't slide through college, I can guarantee you that, and it was difficult. I didn't really learn to study until I got to college in my second year. And that's how things went in those days.
Mother tells stories of coming and teaching you to study. Does that sound familiar?
Well, yes and no. She was a brain. I was not, but she was always reading books. I was playing football and basketball and enjoying life to the fullest during high school. She would read a lot. I didn't. Today I read, well, I'm reading a book today about Truman, who was really one of my ideals, and I'm enjoying it. I know what was going on in his period and his period, as I read, was even worse than what's going on today. And it influenced what will probably be the continuing problems that we have. So I think he was one of the greatest presidents we had.
Well, you said mother was a brain. What was it like living with a brain? I mean, did you find competition? Did they hassle you about?
I didn't have any competition when I was with my sister. That when she was there or thinking about her as a brain or anything like that, but she was more quiet. When she started college, she had her fling. That was the first time that I saw her spread her wings, and she used to enjoy it. She met Bradley Van Dusen. He was a sergeant teaching ROTC at the University of Chicago. And how she met him was very interesting, I think. She worked on the Daily Maroon as a volunteer, and he was making some helping their editorial staff, but he wrote poetry, and he would publish it in the Maroon, and people started catching on that he was writing to someone on the Maroon, and finally he got up enough nerve to talk to her and so forth, and they put two and two together, and but he was on the staff and she was a student, so I don't know whether they frowned upon it or not, but she went with him for a while, and it really, we didn't know how serious it was for several years later when they secretly got married. He was a good guy. He was he was a big man. He was over 6 foot. He was heavy. But he loved that army, and after the university stint, then he went back to New York, and somehow or another, in those days it was going back, and if you had to stay in, you had to take whatever it was in way of salary, and you lose your stripes and so forth, and he stayed in. When they married, he was making $21 a month. And so, though they married, she came home after the marriage, and because they couldn't afford a place to live. And it was maybe 2 years later that she announced that she was married and so forth when they got together again. And they had 2 wonderful children. One was, the older was Bob, who is a brain in himself, and he is has had a tremendous life. He's lived in Germany, he's lived in Belgium. He inherited my father's genius for electrical know-how, and it passed my generation, but it gave it to him, and I'm real proud of it. They had a daughter, Mary Van Dusen, and she was born just a few months before Susie was, our Susie. And at that time her mother was sick, And we were living in Kankakee, Illinois, and so while she was in the hospital for a month, we took care of her. Now Mary was in the baby buggy, and my wife was very pregnant, and with that, people would stand and as we went by and couldn't figure out what was going on, and we let them think that. I imagine in a small town like Kankakee, it was very easy to talk, and they did. But everybody went their own way, and things of our life came along.
When you talked about Mother being sick, what hospital was she in, and do you have any idea why she was ill?
Yes. Jean was ill. She had a breakdown. Started right after her husband was ready to go overseas. And she came home to live with my folks. And she brought Mary and Bob with her, of course, and they lived with my parents. And I would say that my parents influenced their lives as they were just like their own children.
When Mother was, and you were growing up, do you have memories back as early as when you started playing together, or did you always, like my brother was 8 years older than I was, so he had a lot of friends of his own, so I have very few memories of playing with him. But I was wondering whether you played more with your sister when you were small.
When I was small, and your mother, and when I was small, and your mother and I were in school, we were not close. We were more, she was 3 years older than I, but she was not athletically inclined, and I was outside all the time, but she was reading books and studying hard and everything. She graduated in high school in 3 years of a 4-year course. Not many people can do that, but she did. And while she was studying, I was playing. She played the piano, and she played it well. I had to take lessons. We both took lessons. But I remember my last piece that I ever played was humoresque. And I made a bum deal on it. Finally, one time, I got the violin my grandfather left me. In fact, that violin was made in 1620. It was a Jacob Steinweg. I still have it. So I was still in grade school, and my folks thought, well, I should learn how to play the violin. And this, one of Jean's teachers, that's Jean, my sister, her teacher was teaching violin, and I took the first 3 lessons there with her. After the 3rd lesson, she said, "Jack, you're wasting your folks' money." And I agreed and I took my violin and I went home. And I've never tried to play it ever since. But that was part of growing up.
Do you remember my mother playing the guitar? Because I still have it.
Oh yes, I remember when she got it. She played it well.
Can you start that again, because I
Yeah.
talked over for the guitar.
I see what you mean. My sister, Jean, got a guitar one year for Christmas. And she told our folks that she wanted to learn to play the guitar. I think this was about when she was in college. And she tried and she tried and she tried, but she was a better pianist than she was a mandolinist. But at any rate, she could play the music that I couldn't. I finally quit both the piano. Well, she quit when she went to high school, and when I got to high school, well, I quit when I tried those 3 lessons on the violin. So that was the last of mine, but I sure was glad that I didn't have to practice every day, 30 minutes a day.
What was it like being raised by your mother?
She was tough. Real tough. She grew up,
Let's start it again from who she was.
growing up with my mother, it was a difficult deal. She was raised on a ranch in Montana, and she grew up with not on a ranch. There weren't many people, so other than the hands, and the hands were rough and they were tough, and she learned to swear like a trooper. And this was a difficult part of my life. When she would start in, I would leave and go out in the yard or somewhere. It was difficult for my father, who was a very calm and easygoing guy, and she would get excited, and I never understood why or how, but she was not a happy woman. Time went on, and when my father died, she lived for about 8 years after that, and at that point in time she went downhill very fast, and well, I guess today we'd call it Alzheimer's disease, but it was coming on for quite a few years, and she was difficult to live with and be about. My sister Jean, after my dad died, had an apartment, but she would come there every night and stay all night and have dinner there after she'd been to her house for maybe 30 minutes or so. It was a difficult life she had at the end. And my mother was difficult to live with.
What were her strengths, though? I mean, what of her strengths do you have?
I don't know. I really don't know what strengths I have that she had. To be honest with you, I tried not to copy him. I wanted to be more like my father, and so that was probably, maybe she could guess that and so forth. And that was not something that she relished. I I don't mean to say this in the manner of the mommy dearest deal, but it was a part of life going through. I guess that's about brings me up to the conclusion that of having a wonderful family. We're here in Boston this year for Christmas. It's been a wonderful Christmas.
Let me move Nancy over into this chair a little bit and let her ask a few questions she cares about it getting on camera. Now, you keep your position.
Keep my position.
Yeah, you stay over there. You take care of it. And if you notice the trick is, don't nudge fingers. Use body image, but keep the lips sealed while he's talking.
How long are we going to do this?
Oh, until you wear out.
I'm worn out.
Have a drink.
That won't help. We got to get home before it gets dark. So what do I do now?
Nancy will direct.
Well, we had a good
Easy.
Christmas too, so maybe you can tell how this Christmas is different with your grandchildren than when you were a youngster. All the changes you've seen.
No. You know, the one thing that is different in Christmases today for us and when we were young, it's Christmas because of the grandchildren, and it's enjoyed more by Jean and I. I'm speaking for myself more, but rather today we enjoy being with the kids and in the family of the Youngers. Well, we're visiting this Christmas. Nancy has three boys. They range from the age 21. That's John, the elder. John Fleming, younger, and incidentally, the Fleming comes from Jean's family. Jean was a Fleming, and that's John's second name. He's a student today, a junior at Duke University, and doing very well. And he's quite a camper, I found out this trip. And but a good student, and I know that he's going to have a very good and fruitful life. Ryan, number 2, he's going to have his 20th birthday in the next next month. And he too is a great student. Now he's at another university over in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins, and that's a tough place. But he's doing real well. I just heard of all of his grades, and they were tremendous. And so was John's, as a matter of fact. The both of them are inheriting Nancy's and Jerry's background. Jamie, the younger, he's Jamie Younger, and he is the youngest, is quite athletically inclined, and he is doing real well. He plays soccer and basketball, and he wants to be 6'8", but he'll get there. He's got to be patient, and but and he's doing real well in school at Fessenden, and I'm sure that he will be as brilliant and enjoyable as his brothers. Right now, when they argue, it doesn't bother me, because I kind of see them as I would be if I lived in a family of all boys. And I recall that that's the one thing that in our house we weren't able to wrestle and joke like, but the two older boys kind of are on old Jamie, but he holds his own with them. And I think when they came home for Christmas vacation, that he sized them up, and he didn't want them to take over his territory, and they haven't been able to, and he's doing a good job. Jerry, their father, and Nancy's husband, is a great guy. Probably one of the finest men I've ever met. He's an oncologist and doing splendidly. He's my ideal of a son-in-law. I don't want him to know that, but he is. He's just the kind of guy that Jerry is the kind of guy that he's firm. He rules the boys and talks to them. Right today, he's out on the slopes over in Vermont, I believe, and they'll be skiing for the next couple days. It's wonderful to think of how a young man can take his children and be able to I wish that I had been able to fish with my father and do things like those boys are doing today. I think it's wonderful.
You must have spent time with your dad on the railroad and things that you enjoyed.
Well, the trouble...
Or what things did you enjoy doing with your father?
When I was young, I didn't get a chance to do much with my father in the way of socializing and playing ball. Sometimes on weekends we used to play ball together. But my father worked all the time and traveled all the time, and I never got a chance to go camping with him, fishing with him, playing basketball, although we had a basketball court in the backyard. But when he came home over weekends, he would have the job of taking care of the house and getting things back together and on a solid footing. And he always did that, but he never got a chance to really do the things that Jerry is lucky and privileged to do today with his boys. I think it's important that a father do that. I regret that I wasn't able to, with our kids, as much as I wanted to. We were together a lot, but we didn't have, and my first wife died early in life, and I had one son, I don't think I ever fished with him, or might have gone swimming with him a couple times, but we weren't as close as I wanted to be. The girls took care of the house and whatnot, and I guess I was more scared while I was single again than of how I could exist and help them grow up by supplying the money. I think there's more to it in life than just doing that.
When Jim went to Vietnam, you got to visit him when he was in camp and things. You remember some of those visits?
One trip I had up to Fort Lewis in Washington right after Jim was, Jim first, let me say, was drafted, and I took him to the draft board and so forth. The morning they left, gone, at San Jose, and when I came home that night, there was Jim sitting on the couch, and I said, "Well, how did you get home, Jim?" And he says, "I flunked the physical." I said, "You couldn't." And he says, "Oh, it's my bad knee from football," which he did have a bad knee that they wrecked in what he wrecked in high school. So he had already graduated from high school. He was in his first year of college. He was not doing well. He wasn't studying. And about 6 weeks later, he decided on his own, and without any warning, he told me one day, he said, "I enlisted in the Army." I said, "You are not physically fit." And he said, "I didn't tell him about the foot, or the knee, I should say." So he was inducted into the Army and went to Fort Lewis, Washington. Fort Lewis, Washington is a huge place. And I visited him when I was going up. I had been transferred by that time to Chicago, and although that was my old territory, I was overseeing all of this, and including Washington, so I did get up there and made a point of it. And Jim met me at the gate when I arrived, and he said, "Let's have lunch," and we had lunch at the commissary. And then he took me over to some room, and we talked, and that was the one time in my life that I really got a chance to talk with Jim. I think we must have talked for 6 hours.
And then Jim went overseas and came back. You were very proud of him with all the...
Yeah. Jim went overseas within 6 weeks. No, it was not 6 weeks. He was transferred to another camp in the East and spent 6 weeks there, and then was transferred overseas. And in those times, Jim had quite a service. This is in the service at Vietnam. I think an interesting story is one about they were having trouble of the Cambodians coming in, who were then fighting against the United States, and they would come into the camp, not into the camp, but adjacent to it, and lobbing shells into the camp. Finally, they decided that they would make some bunkers in there and mine it. And they had the men patrolling that at night as well as day. Jim was in one of the bunkers one night, and he was taking his first shut-eye, and the other lad in the bunker was watching and looking and so forth, and he awakened Jim, found Jim, Jim awakened, and he said, "I think somebody's out there." In those days, they wouldn't allow him to shoot without permission, which I thought was pretty horrible, but that was the ruling. And so they called into the headquarters and asked for permission to shoot. Jim said they told him that he could only shoot a short burst. Well, they shot quite a bit, probably more than a short burst. But in the morning when they awakened, they weren't awake, they weren't asleep at all during the night. Both of them sat there and with their guns and so forth. But in the morning, when it became light, they found just close to where they were, they saw what looked like a cow. Actually, it was a Brahma bull. And when they called in to notify, they went out and they recognized it as a Brahma bull, and it had some 100 shots fired into it.
When you were a boy, you said you remembered a very different war, the World War II, and you remember your mother taking you downtown. You described the celebration in Chicago at the end of World War II.
At the end of World War II, I'm thinking back now, and I was living in Springfield, waiting to move to Indianapolis, Indiana. I had been transferred, and VE Day came along, and my friends and a couple fraternity brothers that were in the Army were celebrating. I had a job at Springfield, overlooking, in charge of transportation for the Lincoln Ordnance Depot and the selective service for the soldiers and so forth. And I became acquainted with the selective service group. They were all mostly Army, but there were quite a few civilians. And they invited me to the celebration at VE Day. And that day, that afternoon, I was supposed to get back to Kankakee to pick up my wife. And we had such a celebration that I didn't get there until midnight, which she couldn't understand why I'd never gotten there on time. But this celebration and the celebration at the end of World War II, after VJ Day, that was the victory over Japan, was different than as a very small boy. I was 4 years old because the World War I ended in 1918, and my father was in New York. He had just gotten his commission, to go in the service, and he had traveled to New York, and the armistice was signed. So he was not there with us, but my mother and Jean, my sister, and I, with the nice help of the people next door, the Rasmussens, they invited us to ride with them downtown. And I remember, that's the first, I think, of things that I remember of living. And we took some pots and pans. They were very light pots and pans, and some big things to bang with them on, not knives, but mostly spoons. We hit those things, and people were down and just celebrating.
Were there church bells ringing?
Church bells were ringing all over the place. I didn't know how much there was, how many churches there were, but there must have been a mighty lot of them.
How about in your lifetime now? What are some of the biggest changes you've seen?
The biggest changes I've seen in my lifetime is probably in aviation and railroading, in life in general, television, the computer. And as a matter of fact, that's one of my hobbies now that I'm retired, and I can't play golf all the time. I try to play it most of the time, but when I'm not doing that, I play with the computer, and that is one of the greatest things. I was thinking one day that my father, probably with his experience on the railroad and the electrical, the signal part of the railroad, would have loved to have been in this computer age. I wish that I knew more about the computer than I do, and I'm going back in this fall. I think I'll take some more lessons on how to run that thing, because it is the most interesting thing that I know. I think that this is the time that I ought to close the book and say thanks, and I've had an enjoyable time.
Could I ask you a few more questions about my father?
Your father,
Let me change seats so his eyes come to me. Do one more camera change. So, I mean, I know quite a bit about my mother. I know almost nothing about my father.
can you cut it off for a second?
Absolutely.
Button BTR over there.
One thing I think that I'd like to tell in this interview, and probably it really has, nobody has ever discussed my sister Jean's husband. And I think some accolades should come, because he was a nice guy. He was always broke, but so was everybody else. And his job was the Army. He loved the Army. He was a student of the military, and he worked very hard until World War II as a enlisted man. He was an excellent soldier. He was never paid enough in those days to make a mark in life, and when they married, they were broke. They continued to be broke. He was made a lieutenant at the outbreak of the World War II, and at the time that I knew him best was when the month that Jean, my sister, was ill, and he stayed with my folks. I went in on weekends from Kankakee and saw him. He was a diabetic, and unfortunately a diabetic loves sugar. Sugar was his undoing, and I say his undoing, I don't mean it as such, but he craved whiskey, and my folks were more or less teetotalers, and they didn't understand why he did drink as heavily as he did. Now, he was such a big man. He was like 280 pounds, probably close to 300. And he required, from the diabetes, required something like that. And one could say that he overdid it. But one would also have to say that he held it. He could drink a fifth in a day and not show it, never show it. You never could tell that he had anything more than that. He loved his children. He was with them until that time, and I don't know whether he ever saw them after that again, because one of the things after my sister was well, the doctors said that her problem was that his drinking was too heavy, and she couldn't live with that nor have the children, and that her best interests were that if she divorced him. I was her witness. I was their only witness at the divorce case, and my only testimony was that the only thing that I could find wrong with him was that he drank more than he should. He was a big man, so he could really absorb it, but then, of course, I never heard much from him. My sister kind of closed her eyes to her past and never discussed him or her life. She never married again. I think she loved him to the very end. And he went back to Colorado after the war. He retired as a major, and went back to Colorado, and that was the last I heard. That one day my sister told me that he had died, and that was about the end of 1955.
Did you ever visit them in New York?
I visited them in New York after they were still, when they first lived together. They lived in a place on 81 Horatio Street, right in the heart of New York, and they had a one-bedroom apartment. I spent New Year's with them, and they were going to have their friends in for a New Year's party. I was very young, and I thought they were 100 years old, so I thought I wanted to see one thing in New York on New Year's Eve, and that was Broadway. And that's where I headed, that's where I went. And I saw Broadway in the new year coming in. And they had their party. I came home about 2:30 and slept on the couch. And they had a cat. I don't like cats. But that cat, I found her or him, whichever he was. I awakened during the night, and he was on the coffee table right in front of me, and he was watching me. And I had read something somewhere, someplace, where a cat will watch your Adam's apple. And for that scared the living daylights out of me. And I quickly jumped up, put the cat in the bathroom, locked, shut the door, and left him there all night. And that should end my story on a happy note. The cat didn't catch my Adam's apple.
Well, I thank you very, very much for this.
I don't know whether it's a
I think it was great.